Up next, let's head down to Florida and check in with the Freedom Gov, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who famously declared that under his watch, Florida is the freest state in America. Well, Hannah, apparently that freedom doesn't extend to being able to choose what type of groceries you would like to purchase. You won't believe it, but Ron DeSantis' latest target is lab-grown meat.
He is such a Karen, and he's so clearly bored. Like, I can't fathom being governor with all of the problems going on in your state. Like, people can't get home insurance in your state right now, sir. Like, you have bigger fish to fry. And instead of actually coming in and dealing with these very serious pressing problems that actually are in your jurisdiction, you want to come in and regulate what kind of meat people eat. Like, he is such a bag of air. Like, he never does anything of merit. He entirely focuses on the culture war. And this is just another example because, I mean, I think probably most people in our audience are aware of this. I honestly don't even know why this is, but like, red meat eating is like synonymous with being on the right. And if you don't eat red meat and if you favor like veggie burgers, then you're a beta feminine man and can't be respected. Like, I don't know how this became the culture war, but it's been like a part of it for a minute. The only thing I can think is because like maybe Republican men are more likely to be hunters because they're more likely to live in like red rural states. Therefore, like,
what's interesting about this, Hannah, is it's not even about the veggie burger versus actual burger. We are talking about real meat, like meat.
No,
meat.
I know, but I'm saying like he's
It
tapping
is a thing.
into
Like
this.
right-wing people like red meat, blah blah blah. Which look, I like red meat too. But
Red
first,
meat,
Hannah. So before we break
shouldn't
into
be your
this,
identity.
before we break into this a little bit, do you know anything about lab-grown meat? I didn't know a ton about it till I poked into it researching for this segment. But basically, the way that it works is they start with a small amount of meat cells in a lab, and then they feed the cells nutrients and oxygen, and they basically have them multiply. And you basically create a large amount of meat cells out of a small starting amount. And you end up with something that is at the cellular level identical to meat, although no animals, except for wherever the original cells came from, no animals had to be killed. In the future, it could potentially be done much cheaper than, raising animals from birth to adulthood and feeding them and transporting grain and all this stuff. And it could also potentially have way less pollution and carbon emissions. And if it's done cheaper, it can be sold cheaper. So you could have like $2 steaks eventually, right? That would be grown in a lab instead of having to raise a cow and then going through all that and transporting it all around. But apparently, Ron DeSantis doesn't want to see that technology evolve. He has just this past week signaled that he is open to and supportive of legislative efforts at the state level to ban the sale and development of lab-grown meat in the state of Florida. Take a listen to what Ron DeSantis had to say.
How they do. They blame agriculture for global warming. I know the legislature's doing a bill to try to protect our meat. You need meat, okay? And we're going to have meat in Florida. Like, we're going to have fake meat. Like, that doesn't work. So we're going to make sure to do it right. But there's a whole ideological agenda that's coming after, I think, a lot of important parts of our society.
So DeSantis has some allies in the state legislature who are looking to do this through legislation that ideally he will support and sign. And they, according to Florida Voice, their reporting, it says that Senator Jay Collins, a Republican state senator from Tampa, spoke on Florida's Voice about some of his agricultural priorities for the 2024 legislative session, including a farmer tax break and banning lab-grown meat. Collins also brought up his ethical concerns with lab-grown meat as one of the main reasons why his legislation, SB 1084, bans it. Let's look at what you're doing here, he said. You're growing cells in a cultivated petri dish and creating protein to eat. There are many ethical boundaries that this steps in and, frankly, over. I don't really have anything to say to that other than, okay, boomer. Like, this is the most technophobe, archaic thinking. What's more unethical? Growing meat in a lab by feeding cells, or the factory farming as we know it? Like, make that make sense.
Let me guess the number of times this guy's come out and spoken out against IVF, like his people are probably using. Like, this is so hypocritical. I don't buy it for a second. I know what's going on here. It's what I mentioned earlier. It's the culture war thing. It's also Ron DeSantis wanting to push back on any like thing that is tied to the climate agenda, which this in some ways is, because there are arguments that this would be better for the environment as well.
But
and
it's
then
like
the
a
third
good
thing,
version of the climate agenda. It's
I
like
know,
a free
but he
market.
doesn't care. He
Yeah.
doesn't want a free market. He doesn't care. He just wants to fight the culture war. But the third thing, this is the most important thing that you need to know that's going on here. This is protectionism for farmers. That's all this is. That's all it boils down to. And guys, oh boy, if you don't know about the agriculture industry in this country, I have a full in-depth episode on my channel on that. It will make your blood boil. This industry is completely overrun with the government. They're totally in bed with one another. We spend so much corporate welfare propping farmers up, ensuring that there's not much competition for them. And when it comes to meat in particular, man, oh man, is the government running a racket. There's something called the Prime Act that Thomas Massie has been trying to pass for some time that deals with some of the insane regulations and cronyism just around like the distribution of meat in this country. But he says it all in the first clip when he mentions their farmers in the state. And this is something you'll often see politicians do, is pander to farmers because they have this image of being like the good old American hard worker, industrious. They're very politically favorable to bring up and talk about. And they're usually parts of very large lobbying groups that spend a lot of money on politicians and keep them well funded. And so they work hand in hand together. And that's what's happening right now, is that this is something that could undercut that whole scheme going on in our meat industry right now. And it is something that is really like an amazing innovation of capitalism that could go a long way towards eliminating world hunger. We've already made tremendous strides to that end, but this could really expedite some of that and not just get rid of world hunger, but get rid of like undernutrition for kids, right? Because even once people are fed, getting proper nutrition, getting enough protein is often still an issue on top of that. So this is a really cool, miraculous intervention. There's no reason that you should oppose it on any like sensible grounds. The only reason to do so are the reasons I just listed here. And I think it's really like, it makes me think of the diamond industry, Brad, where in recent years, lab-grown diamonds have really taken off, and they are literally the same. Like, they are the same. I don't really think you would be able to tell under a microscope the difference in a diamond and a lab-grown diamond. And yet there is still this perception that they are like less than or not as good or not as desirable. And it's ridiculous. It's all spin. Like, it is being created in a lab. That doesn't mean that it's negative or bad. It just means that the price is going to fall because the supply is increasing. That's not a bad thing unless you're making your livelihood off the supply being restricted so that you can charge more. So that's very similar to, I think, what's happening here, and people need to be aware of this grift.
Yeah, I have a couple additional thoughts on it. One is that Ron DeSantis has famously attacked old guard GOP style politicians like Nikki Haley as, quote, warmed over corporatists, basically implying that they're not really free market or conservative. They collude with big business and big government. And you know what? He's not entirely wrong. However, I have a hard time imagining anything more warmed over and corporatist than using the force of the government to ban an entire form of food production to protect a favored industry from competition that might lower prices for consumers or give them more options. I also find this deeply paternalistic and totally anathema to this idea of being the freedom governor in the free state of Florida. Like, a lot of people out there probably don't want lab-grown meat, and that's totally fine. Like, nobody should be forcing you to have it. But the idea that the government has to come and override the decision-making of the people to choose, maybe some people want to try it. Maybe if it gets cheap and it's cheaper than regular meat, some people who are skeptical will try it and then like it. Maybe it never catches on. Maybe no one ever likes it. But regardless, that's something people can choose in a market, right? But he wants to override that for everybody. That is totally inconsistent with the way he talks about the woke progressives who want to control your life and all that. And he's totally not wrong, but then he's doing the same thing in this different way. And it's also just part and parcel of technophobia that I'm really seeing resurgent on the right. The idea that new things are scary and bad because they're unnatural, which is one of the most, I think, basic logical fallacies. This idea that what is natural is good and what is unnatural is bad. Actually, what is natural is completely morally neutral, right? Hurricanes and earthquakes that kill people are natural. Where also, of course, like human life is natural and childbirth and wonderful things are natural. At the same time, nuclear bombs are unnatural. But so are so many of the medicines and vaccines that have saved millions of lives. Whether something's natural or unnatural is completely irrelevant to its morality or utility. Yet I constantly am seeing this irrational fear of scary new tech and unnatural things overriding people's basic principles on the right these days, and I find it really, really alarming.
Yeah, it gives Unabomber vibes, honestly. Like, all your tits. It's a bit much.